Hi, my name is Tanya Marione. I'm the Jersey City Planning Director. Thank you for tuning into this video. In this video, I will be going over all of the proposed changes for the Phase 2 Master Plan implementation for zoning. I'm going to share my screen so we can go through some of these slides together. Okay, so the master plan, which was approved in 2022 early, we have now at this point gone through the first phase. I will go over some of that a little bit, not in too much depth, but we are now implementing the second phase. This was approved already by the Jersey City Planning Board on June 13th. It will be going to City Council for its first reading, which is also known as the introduction, on August 16th, and for second reading, which will be the official adopting vote for September 7th. Like I said, the master plan was adopted in early 2022. That was a result of about 2 years worth of meetings, input that resulted in the final master plan. There were roughly 160 recommendations that were made to map changes, text, or even policies. I can show you a little bit later in this video where you can find everything on the city planning website, but the city planning website is a great resource for you to find the master plan, the prior zoning changes, and of course the zoning changes that are proposed right now currently. We hope to bring most of these changes in through phases. Phase 1 really was focused on our historic commercial areas that had been rezoned residential within the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it was a real focus to kind of bring them back to their historic mixed-use commercial corridor. Leading up to just the changes for Phase 2, not Phase 1, a variety of community meetings, walking tours, and public comment periods were held. I know you can see the screen in front of you. I just want to go over a few things. You can see that we have gone through 6 community general meetings. 4 of them were in person. They were done on a ward basis. We did 4 additional walking tours where we again talked specifically about the Phase 2 changes that are proposed. And then we offered a public comment period for a little over a month after the draft was provided to everybody through email on our website. And then we made adjustments to those texts through the comments that we received back. And of course, we also held meetings or just had phone calls if a person or an association reached out to us and needed some extra info. I'm going to go through a few of the slides now that are going to go over generally the summary of the changes. It's going to be a lot of words. So by the time we get through them piece by piece, they'll make a little bit more sense. But I want to talk about them more general, and then we can kind of drill down, right? So the recommendations that you'll be seeing on the slide, the general recommendations and the actions taken, the general recommendations are recommendations that came directly from the master plan. And the actions taken were actions that were also recommended from the master plan that we had to take and kind of modify based on the input that we got back from the community, from your local council people, and so on. So the first recommendation was rezoning an area where it was appropriate to reflect existing multifamily land use character. We will be retiring the R1 district, R1W district, and area rezoning to the R2. Again, this is something I'm going to be talking about in just a few minutes. I just want to kind of overall talk about these things now. We're merging the R1A and the R1F, which historically have been known as our large lot zoning districts. And we are condensing kind of our table of contents for zoning so that things makes a little bit more sense when you're reading through them. And they'll be into RH1 and RH2, which is residential housing 1, residential housing 2. And again, these will continue to signify a large lot zoning, whether that be width or depth. We are allowing ADUs, attached accessory dwelling units. They will be permitted in the RH1, the RH2, and the R1 and the R2. We are adding a restaurant overlay to McKinley Square. Pieces of Communipaw will be changing from commercial automotive and even R1 to the NC, which is our neighborhood commercial. I'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing to the neighborhood commercial to start to differentiate different levels and intensities of neighborhood commercial. And really kind of focusing more on the R1, which is the majority of our zoning throughout the city. Right now, the R1 allows for 1 and 2 family dwellings on a 25 by 100 lot. And based on studies that we did of all the lots within all of the R1, we are now proposing a 42 units an acre standard. We're standardizing height requirements. We're increasing permeability. We're providing for attached housing, so different kinds of housing types. Again, we are considering lot sizes and lot standards. We did find that there was a predominant width, but not necessarily predominant depth. We're allowing for more townhouse lot subdivisions, which is kind of a callback to, again, historic zoning. We are now encouraging people to rehab historically significant structures by allowing for additional density. We are creating new design guidelines. The design guidelines have always been a part of the zoning, but now we are kind of putting them more at the forefront, making them a little bit more stringent, more required. And we're dealing with parking in some of the areas based on the feedback that we got from the community residents, which we can go through a little bit later. This is overall map changes that are going to be made. Again, I know that there's a lot. It will make a little bit more sense as we go through it. Okay, so the first recommendation that we're going to kind of be talking about right now, consider rezoning areas where it may be appropriate to reflect the existing multifamily land and land use character or the desired development pattern based on the existing content. This is specifically for the Webster Avenue corridor between Griffith and South. This was a redevelopment plan. This was the Webster Ave redevelopment plan in the 70s. And a few years ago, we retired it from redevelopment, but continued the same exact zoning, the underlying zoning, which we now call R1W or R1 Webster. And in order to really kind of make our zoning table again make more sense, in order to have a little bit more kind of efficient and consistent zoning standards. We studied the R1W, we studied the standards, and we are proposing to rezone that area as R2, which is an existing zone. The R2 definitely better reflects the appropriate land use character and also complements the R1W district zoning that's there now. These are two examples of, not two examples, these are two, there's a table showing the differences between the R1W and what the R2 requires or permits, right? So we still have 4 stories, 40 feet, that's not changing. The max building coverage is increasing, but you'll see a little bit down further that actually what it really is because the rear yard standard is so tight, where it's just 10 feet in the rear yard right now, we're requiring it to 30%. So that even though you see that there's a building max coverage of 60%, if you were always requiring a 10-foot rear yard, you were most likely always exceeding that 60% building max coverage. The minimum lot size was 1,600 square feet. The minimum lot size in the R2 is 1,800. For reference, right, 1,600 square feet is still a lot lower than the 2,500 square feet, which is the minimum lot requirement in the R1. So already we're looking at a zone that is very drastically different from the R1 zone. Based on a density study of those 2 blocks, the consistent average density was 51 units an acre, which winds up to be 3 units on a 25 by 100 lot. And the permitted R2 density is 55 units an acre, which again is 3 units on a 25 by 100 lot. The parking is probably where it differentiates the most. Parking was 1 per unit, whereas we are really trying to have a consistent parking standard throughout the city based on really more proximity to mass transit. But unless you have a lot that is 50 feet or wide, parking is prohibited, and then otherwise it's 0.3 spaces per bedroom, which usually winds up being about 1 space per every 3 bedrooms. And just as kind of a visual, you can see the difference. The R1W is on my right, looking at it, and that would be permitted. That's the zoning that's permitted right now. That's the zoning that was permitted within the redevelopment. And the R2 zoning, which is what we are proposing to change it to, is the zoning that we would be seeing today. So again, you can kind of see that there's really not too much difference. It's really just a way to clean up our zoning and to also create zoning that's a lot more compliant or a lot more in line with the zoning and design standards that we are currently using. Merge R1A and R1F to allow 3 families in these areas of conditional use if separate districts are maintained, established residential district as in the R1. So R1A and R1F historically, so you know what the background between these districts were. This is almost a prehistoric designation. This was mostly focused within areas of the west and the south of Jersey City, on lots that were typically larger than 25, whether they be 30, 40, or 50 feet wide. What was happening is that these houses, these lots were being purchased, the homes were being demolished in order to allow for subdivision for 2 lots. Because on a 50 by 100, you have 2 as of right 25 by 100 lots in the R1. So as a way to preserve those larger lots, we created R1A, which is really just a reference to the ward. That's Ward A, R1A, R1F, again, a reference to the ward, Ward F, R1F. Now, these took into consideration that A, yes, there was a larger lot, but B, that there was also 3 units, more or less, and 3 units was permitted in the R1F as a conditional use. So it's not a new conditional use that we are proposing. It's an existing conditional use within the R1A and the R1F that we are just continuing now. So the R1H and the R2H, which are the RH1, really, which is merging the R1F and the R1A, will continue to be really more focused on those wide, large lot zoning. The RH2 is the new zone that we are creating. RH2 really does continue to talk about larger lots, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the lots are large in width. Typically, these larger lots are actually larger in depth. And they, again, in the similar way that the R1A and the R1F were used as kind of precursors to historic designation, that's exactly how we are using the RH2 currently. The RH2 will be in areas of Sherman Place. As you can see in front of you, Sherman Place will also have RH1. This zoning, this area has already been studied and has already been recommended by the master plan to become the next historic district. So RH1 is also proposed as part of the West Bergen Lincoln Park District. The West Bergen Lincoln Park District, if you are familiar with that, has the zoning is an overlay zoning, and it's the R1 zoning. The RH1 zoning more appropriately mirrors the zoning that's there, which again, the R1A and the R1F were zoning that was written for specifically these types of lots and specifically preserving those larger lots. We continue again just for the conditional use for the 3 units that existed, that is just continuing to exist. The ADUs allow detached and carriage houses to be converted to ADUs to increase affordable housing options. I want to be very clear, even though we are seeing the words affordable housing option, I am not talking about required affordable housing. We are talking about availability, that they are going to be smaller and most likely cost less than it would be to rent a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. So what does that look like, right? So the definition, which we added in phase 1, allows 1 additional unit in a separate accessory structure. So it cannot be attached. It cannot be part of your garage that is within your structure. It has to be a complete accessory structure, and it is allowed to add 1 unit and no more than that. It is going to be permitted in the R1H, the R2H, the R1, and the R2. So the images in front of you right now, you have, of course, the R1. The R1 is a 25 by 100 zone, lot coverage 75, density 42 units an acre, which is just 2 units. And now we're looking at, on the right, the R1 plus an ADU. So here's some of the criteria for the ADU to even be on a site. Number one, and the visual on the right is a little tricky, and I will say that because any accessory dwelling unit, any unit has to meet all building code requirements. So it needs a complete immediate access from that unit to the right of way. And that access alleyway or whatever it is has to be a minimum of 3 feet wide, which means that I leave my door, I leave the door of my accessory dwelling unit, and I can walk right out to the sidewalk. I cannot walk through another building that does not meet building code. We are allowing accessory dwelling units, but they have to continue to meet the building and the lot coverage. So if you have a building where the lot coverage is already only permitted to be 75%, your accessory dwelling unit can only be an additional 5% coverage, and that includes in the building. So if the building is 60% and your building already takes up 55%, your accessory dwelling unit can only take up an additional 5%. So we're not looking at structures that are going to be taking up the entire rear yard. We're looking at structures that, again, have to conform to the building, the lot coverages, and the building code requirements. They are allowed to be up to 18 feet high, 2 stories. Accessory structures right now are permitted to be up to 15 feet. So this is only an additional feet to allow for that additional story. And part of the reason is if you wanted to continue using that ground floor as a garage for your storage, for your car, whatever it is, you can continue to do so and put the unit on the top floor. So here's some examples. I wanted to walk through some real life examples of places that could potentially turn into accessory dwelling units. The image all the way on the top left is a large lot on Webster Avenue. You can see the house, the porch, and to the left there is a garage in the rear. Now, if the owner of this home wanted to convert that garage, just the ground floor itself, into an accessory dwelling unit, they could do that. If they wanted to add another, let's say that this is 10 feet, if they wanted to add another 8 feet to create a second story to allow for that dwelling unit to be there, they can also do that. Again, this is the same situation for a garage in Society Hill, I apologize, in Country Village. That's the picture in the right corner. Similar situation. And again, some of the things that I want to call to the attention is the immediate access way for somebody to leave their accessory dwelling unit and to come right out to the sidewalk. The picture on the bottom is an example of what will not be permitted. So even though we are looking at Beach Street, that's pretty much between Liberty and Tunnelly Avenue, we are seeing homes, we are seeing a lot of rear structures. None of these structures would meet the building code for the accessory dwelling unit requirements. Now, whether they would meet the accessory dwelling unit requirements for the zoning, I can't say for sure because I don't know the existing building and lot coverage of any of these sites, but I am showing you a picture of what really frequently is the development pattern in Jersey City. Are buildings that are attached, or they are attached and they are attached on one side and detached on the other, and the other detached side is less than 3 feet, meaning that none of the structures in the rear, none of these separate structures would meet the building code requirement, and none of these structures could be turned into an accessory dwelling unit. Next recommendation, consider new zoning in neighborhood centers to promote density and commercial activity around existing infrastructure. The McGinley Square area, we are introducing the restaurant overlay zone. If you are not familiar with the restaurant overlay zone, it simply means that restaurants category 1, category 2, which is really whether or not they are mostly takeout or they are mostly sit down, are permitted. And what this also allows is an increase or the increase in availability of a liquor license. We have restaurant overlay zones, or what you might hear people call ROZ, all throughout the city, whether that's downtown, Newark Avenue, West Side Avenue, and the McGinley Square. Sid had asked us to introduce it here as well. Now, the neighborhood commercial is currently just one zone. It is a 5-story zone with ground floor retail, restaurants on the top 4 floors typically, although the entire building within the neighborhood commercial zone can be all commercial. What neighborhood commercial does not permit typically is ground floor residential. The recommendation that was made in the master plan was to differentiate height and density sizes of the neighborhood commercial corridors, noticing that the pattern was different in some places, that we were still looking at commercial corridors, commercial centers, but some of them were taller and more dense than others. Their recommendation was the NCS, NCM, and NCL, right? The NCS is really what we have right now. The NC, that's 5 stories. Their NCM is 6 to 8 stories, and their NCL was 8 to 12. Now, that was, again, that master plan recommendation. Looking at it, really what we thought the best thing to do was to take our NC, and instead of introducing letters to our zoning, whereas right now we have R1, R2, R3, and we wanted to continue that language. So we have NC1, NC2, and NC3. Now, NC1 continues to be the NC zone that we all know. This is really only impacting Communipaw Avenue. Communipaw between Bergen and West Side is a mix of commercial automotive, R1. If you've driven down there, it is actually predominantly, whether that be commercial, with single stories, commercial vacant lots. I believe there's even a big house of worship over here. We're proposing to change it all into the NC1, which is continuing that neighborhood corridor east of Bergen. And then the next after that is west of West Side Avenue, going to Mallory, stopping at Mallory, and that's the NC zone, which is comparable to the master plan's recommendation of the NCM or the NC medium. We're calling it NC2, and instead of going to 8 stories, we're capping it at 6 stories. And again, this zone right now is zone commercial automotive. We are not removing every place where commercial automotive uses can be proposed. We are just removing those allowed permitted uses from this part of Communipaw Avenue. So we actually, within the last round and with even in this round, we increased the places where commercial automotive could go. For example, it was not permitted on Tunnelly Avenue, was not permitted on Route 440, when these are ideal places for commercial automotive uses. So we now allow all commercial automotive uses all along Tunnelly, all along Route 440. And in some areas where there's redevelopment, in the west side where we still have those continued industrial buildings, we're allowing interim uses for commercial automotive uses. In a lot of our redevelopment plans, not just within the west, those existing industrial uses can be converted on an interim, time-limited basis to a commercial automotive use or some industrial kind of use. Because we are going from a commercial automotive use to a mixed use, this will trigger the inclusionary zoning ordinance, which means that any development in this NC district on this portion of Communipaw that is over 15 units will automatically require an on-site affordable 10%. No parking is permitted on lots that are less than 50 feet wide. We are looking for large 15 feet sidewalks, 3 feet planting buffers, and a lower parking requirement at 0.2 parking spaces per bedroom. Again, we are really looking to increase pedestrian safety, pedestrian accessibility, and make this more of a commercial corridor where people can continue to walk. If you have walked down the street, you can know that it is dangerous to walk or dangerous to bike, and it is battled between two just neighborhoods, right? Mallory Avenue is a pretty kind of small neighborhood as well, and West Side Avenue, and so this will allow Communipaw to be kind of a little bit tamed down, more pedestrian, to bring more kind of comparable uses to the area, and of course to improve not just pedestrian access, but to also kind of complement, the Lincoln Park, which is one of the largest parks that we have in Jersey City. NC3, which is that NCL 8 to 12. The only thing we're doing with this is we're taking these orphan zones, OR and CBD, which is office residential and central business district. These are orphan zones that were there prior to the Journal Square redevelopment plan. They are almost identical. They are 10 stories. They have 150 units an acre, except in the CBD where there is no density. So the only thing we are doing is taking those OR and those CBD zones. We're not changing the density. We're not changing the height. We're not changing almost any of the actual zoning regulations. We are only changing the name. So again, we're looking at that consistent kind of zoning table of contents, right? NC1, NC2, NC3, 5 stories, 6 stories, 10 stories. Now let's go into the R1. As I said previously, the R1, or if you're looking at the map to your right, is almost everything that's in white, right? So it is a large portion of the city. It is 30% of all of the Jersey City land. It is a 2-unit, 3-story residential zone. The use is 1 and 2 family. There is no density standard. And the last major overhaul done for the R1 was done in 2001, so over 20 years ago. We're going to take a look back at the history of how this area, this zone, this R1 kind of evolved over time. Pre-1974, we had residential A and residential B. Now, residential B would more mirror in size-wise and geography-wise what we now know as R1. And you can see that it continued to allow 2 units, but it also allowed apartment houses, rooming houses, and the height was 1.5 times the street width. Now, after 1974, we are taking the residential B, we're turning it into the R2. That's when that language of the R1 and the R2 starts to be introduced. The R1 is still this much smaller area. The actual R1 pre-2000 and the residential A were really only in very specific areas. I think, but one of them, I believe, is the Stegman Courts, the Stedman Place, that area, and a smaller area of Gifford. And those were the only places really that were capped or limited to just the 2 units or single family units. The majority of the city allowed for apartments, and that has been the well, let's say not just apartments, let me just say more than 2 units since prior to 1974. And again, let's kind of just go over what that looked like. The apartment houses, the rooming houses. Then after 1974, we start changing that language to row or townhouses that are 16 feet wide in a row, very similar to what we see downtown, also known as brownstones in some instances. And that's just really more of a reference, of course, to the material. They permitted apartment buildings. They allowed for 4 stories and for 40 feet height. And again, pretty big units at 5 feet front yards, 15 feet rear yards. In 2000, when we changed the zoning, the last master plan overall, 20 years ago, we took the R2 and we created the R1. Now, what's important about this is that you go from the creation of zoning to up to 2000, which is at least a minimum of 50 or 60 years of the, again, 30% of Jersey City continuing to allow a variety of uses, not just 1 and 2 family. 1 and 2 family were always permitted. You could always build a single, or you could always build a 2 family, but they also permitted things like townhomes, which would have had 3 or 4 units, row homes, which would have been narrower lots, which means that in general, the density would have been higher. If you have a lot that is 16 feet wide and you have 2 units on it, and you have a lot that's 25 feet wide and you have 2 units on it, the density for that 16 foot wide is still going to be higher than the 25. So we are looking at the development pattern of Jersey City, the majority of the city actually developing at a higher density at 2 units a lot until 2001, where we capped that zoning. So the conversation of the R1 becoming a 1 and 2 family only district really only came into our conversation in the year 2000, 20 years ago, where we artificially capped the density and no longer permitted apartment, townhomes, row homes, or any kind of variety of uses. Instead, we just went to one structure, one 3-story, 1 and 2 family unit structure. Now the R2 continued to kind of allow for those townhomes, those 4 stories, those 55 units an acre, but was only permitted in certain areas. It was permitted primarily within the Palisade Avenue district, which today is not the R2, is much more of a commercial corridor. Existing R1 standards. If you're looking at the lot right now, you're looking at a lot that is 25 feet wide by 100 feet deep. This is the standard minimum lot size within the district. It is primarily a 3-story detached building. We do, of course, allow it to be attached. There is no standard one way or the other, is no requirement. If you have a building that is attached on one side and a new building comes, that new building can be attached to that other building, creating the continual attached block front. Now, the building height, as is regulated right now, varies from 30 feet to 44 feet because it is set by floor to ceiling height, whereas the maximum floor to ceiling height could be 12 feet. So you would be looking at a 44-foot high building. It is a 2-car garage. Those cars are parked tandem, the 10-foot curb cut, typically centered. We have front yard setbacks that match the predominant front yard setbacks of the block. And we have varying rear yard setbacks. And I say it's varying because the way the rear yard setback standard reads today is that the front yard plus whatever the rear yard is has to equal 35 feet. So you have a building that is 65 feet long and it is basically just shifting, right? So if I have a 10-foot front yard setback and I have a 25-foot rear yard setback, I continue to have the same building. If I have a 5, now I have a 30-foot rear yard setback, and so on. Over the last 20 years, because of the fact that we basically capped the density and the types of housing that was permitted within the R1 district, we created, or there were a lot of variances that were triggered, a lot of given, because again, that 1 and 2 unit lot, 1 and 2 unit, not really taking into consideration whether the lot might have been larger or smaller, was permitted, period. So not even just to say that 1 and 2 units were permitted, but there was a required density prior to 2000, which meant that if you had a lot that was over 25 feet by 100, over 2,500 square feet, and the density allowed for 3 units, you wouldn't have had to gone to a board to allow for density or for use variance. By taking away the density standard and only permitting 1 and 2 family as uses, anytime you went to any unit above 2, it triggered immediately a use variance. And because Jersey City does not have, consistent lots everywhere, it didn't take into consideration the variation. And so a lot of variances were given or requested because mainly due to varying lot sizes and really kind of that inflexibility. So the recommendation is to establish an overall residential density to accommodate 2 or 3. And again, this is a little bit of a harking back to the history here, is that prior to 2000, this area, the majority of the city again, was owned by density, and the uses were varying or flexible versus 1 or 2 family, townhouse, row homes, or apartment houses. So in 2000, we got rid of the density. We only allowed for the 1 and 2 family uses. The recommendation is to go kind of harken back to the more historical way that we zoned in the 50s and the 60s, and that was through density. Conversations with the community really left a lot of uneasiness with an as of right 3-unit building. So we did a complete study of all of the lots within Jersey City that were within the R1, and that's the map that you're seeing before you. And the corresponding numbers on the map go to the corresponding chart on the right. And as you can see, the flux kind of average number of units is either 3 to 2. But the average density that we're proposing, the 42 units an acre, is not an average that we kind of just came up with out of random. It was a density and average that we're proposing based on our study of lot and density existing throughout the R1 right now. The 42 units an acre will continue to result in 2 units on a 25 by 100 lot. The only thing that we added in the terms of the third unit is we're proposing or allowing for a conditional third unit as an adaptive reuse of the garage. And this allows for the garage to be converted into that third unit. But in order for that third unit to be created as a conditional use, they have to remove the curb cut. They have to put back front yard landscaping, and they have to put a knee wall. And the reason for that is so that it doesn't inadvertently allow or permit or encourage front yard parking. Part of the reason for this is, if you can kind of see the charts below, is that illegal thirds are a huge violation or a huge issue that we deal with in Jersey City. The building, the typology, the zoning regulations that were created in 2000 almost lend itself to this third unit. But the parking and the majority of these third units, these 3 full floors, were really just encouraging people to convert their garages illegally into third units, and of course not use their garages for any kind of car parking. So this is a 20-year issue that is kind of endemic, and what we had conversations with the community really was to allow that third unit only in the instance that it would bring back on-street public parking. Some of the issues, again, like I brought up, I said that some of the zoning regulations that were created in 2000 kind of created some situations that we are trying to correct. And some of the ways that were recommended to do that through the master plan were to standardize the height requirements, of course, increase permeability, and provide for a variety of attached, detached types of housing. If you're looking, I want to talk about the 44 feet versus the 35 feet height difference. If you're looking at the screen, take a look down to the corner right. You can see that where I come up with the 44 feet is that you can have a house that is 40 feet or 44 feet tall. That's just a 3-story house. But the appearance of a 44-foot house, tall house and 3 stories, is still going to be towering over the existing predominant houses on the block that were just 35 feet tall or 30 tall, or just the 2.5 stories, 25 feet to 30 feet high. And so by really standardizing it and kind of getting away from this blocks and just allowing for a 35-foot high building, we are also creating a little bit more conformity with a building typology with the existing block. We lowered the building coverage, lowered the lot coverage from 85 to 75. I kind of talked about this a little bit before about with the ADUs, right? So we're lowering the lot coverage. We're allowing these ADUs, but again, the ADUs have to meet the lot coverage. I don't want to go too kind of overmixed, but I just want you to know that we have heard a lot of issues and concerns about permeability, about runoff, about concrete, and so lowering the lot coverage is a response to that. And we are allowing for a little bit more variety of attached or detached housing. But again, it has to be contextual. Consider rezoning area to reflect multifamily based on the development pattern. So areas where we were originally proposing on lots that were 5,000 square feet or more for a 4-story building. Actually, I'm sorry, not 5,000, 7,500 square feet or more for a 4-story building. We are no longer proposing that based on the feedback that we got from our community meetings. So we are now taking that off, and we are just kind of, but this slide is really an example to show you that these apartment buildings, these 4-story buildings, they are all throughout Jersey City. It's not just one area versus another. This is actually a pretty consistent development pattern. But in response to the community, we are not going to propose the 4 stories. We'll be capping it at 3 stories. And the only real kind of difference that we are allowing for a lot that's over 5,000 square feet is, instead of having the predominant front yard setback, they can have a maximum of 5 feet. And the reason we propose that are the pictures that you can see in front of you right now, which is that this is really the predominant development style evolving over Jersey City that has kind of always been there, that these larger buildings tend to be more close to the front yard and to have these types of setbacks. In some areas, again, prioritizing lot width over lot depth. We're continuing to maintain the 25-foot lot width requirement because, based on our study that you saw a few slides back, 25 feet wide is actually pretty consistently the average lot depth, lot width in most of Jersey City. However, the lot depth is kind of all over the map. We have a lot of undersized lots. The lots that are oversized, we are kind of protecting for that RH1 or that RH2. But to kind of harken back to the zoning pre 1974 or even pre 2000, that really matches the historical development and evolution of Jersey City's building. We're allowing for those townhomes and those row homes. That type of development pattern that was always permitted in those areas, and it's in some of the areas, parts of Jersey City that most of us, when we think about, we love. This isn't just something that town. These are buildings that are on Princeton Avenue. These are buildings all over Jersey City. Again, this is just another example. There's a tax map on the bottom left, and you can see that the tax map matches the buildings that are building picture that's in front of you. These homes are a variety from 12 and a half to 13 and a half feet wide, and they're all 50 feet deep. So they are small homes, and they are, again, a reference to that kind of older zoning, that townhome, that row house zoning. And one of the things that we are proposing that is new to this is what we are calling the townhouse subdivision provision, which allows you to take 2 lots that don't already look like this, but that may be 2 conforming 25 by 100 lots or more, or 4 25 by 100 lots, and create development patterns that look more like this. So this here, we have 2 25 by 100 lots, 2 standard R1 lots. And now it is the same lot size, but we are allowing for 5 20 by 50 lots, which is actually double the width of the homes that you're seeing in this picture. Same story here, but allowing for 4 and also creating a 7-foot alleyway. And a little bit larger here, where we can create the alleyway and two rows of the 4 units. This allows for a few things beyond the fact that it's kind of a nod to the historical zoning and development pattern in Jersey City, but it allows for a variety of housing affordability. Again, I'm going to be reluctant to use the word affordable because this is not set aside, mandated, required, regulated affordable housing, but these are smaller units. They are smaller townhomes, so it is more likely that these will be home ownership, and they will be fee simple and a little bit more affordable for home ownership, for purchasing. And so that's kind of creating that variety in the housing market, and allowing folks to come in on the kind of the entry side of home ownership and still own a townhome, or have the option of a townhome versus maybe a condo in the middle of a mixed use in a multi-unit building. Again, this is another picture, another example of how this already exists in Jersey City. You can kind of see that these are 25 feet wide by 50 feet deep. Similar example, 20 by 50. These are already existing. This is on Henry and Chestnut. And another example here with the 7-foot alleyway. This is actually, I believe, on 14th Street. And homes that front onto this little alleyway. You kind of get that sense in the other homes that card that. There was a lot of concern and a lot of things that were brought up about concerns around demolition. So in order to encourage rehabilitation and restoration and to avoid demolition, the master plan recommended that we allow for additional residential density to allow for these buildings to be restored. And so we're taking a note from that. Is a conditional use. They have to be denied by the historic preservation officer. Say that they are historically significant in some way or form. They cannot be demolished. And as a result, they can go from 42 units an acre, which are 2 units on a regular lot, to 75 units an acre, which is 4 units on a regular lot. In downtown Jersey City, a regular brownstone, a regular kind of 4-story unit is 75 units an acre, 4 units a lot. And the intent here, of course, is to encourage the preservation of the significant buildings, to avoid demolition, especially demolition by neglect, and for them to be restored in a way that meets historic standards, not just to be restored as a facadectomy or whatever. They have to meet the standards required by the historic officer. Here's a great example of something that would have just been allowed to be 1 and 2 family and kind of demolition by neglect. By increasing the density to allow for 4 units here, kind of offsets the amount of rehabilitation that would need to happen in order to preserve the structure. This is a structure that was denied demolition. And so we are hoping to see that with this conditional use provision, this will save some of these structures, restore them to what their historic to their historic standards. We are looking at design guidelines that promote rehabilitation and compatible new development. Again, as I said earlier, this requirement already exists, but it exists more as a suggestion, and now we are making it a requirement. So let me walk you through this slide of what you're seeing before you. Again, the building in the middle, the gray one that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. There's a few things kind of here that we can flag. One, of course, is that we are looking at a building that is significantly taller than the other buildings. Again, let's talk about that height difference, right? The 9 to 12 feet floor to ceiling, the fact that we can kind of have these varying stories. So we're just kind of faced with a building that's going to be a predominantly garage. Now we are saying not just the 35 feet cap, but we're saying that, you know, your entry, right? The entry of the finished first floor has to match the entry of the neighbor. So what's this going to create? This is going to create stoops. This is going to create porches, smaller garages that are a little bit more diminished. But we also want to see compatible materials. The neighbors to the right and to the left have siding, whether it's vinyl or aluminum, I don't know, it doesn't matter. But what matters is that the building in the middle is metal and brick. And that's not a material that's compatible. So just kind of looking at these things, we already know that it should be siding. We should be seeing a porch or a stoop. And potentially it looks like it can go either way on the type of roof pitch. You can have a gable or you can have a flat. It looks like the building to the left had a cornice that was covered up. And that might be the only thing within the middle building that is somewhat connected to the block, that there might be some buildings on this block that have that kind of cornice. This is not a new recommendation. This is an existing regulation. A parking study was done for the city a few years ago. As a part of this master plan, we were encouraged to create consistent parking standards. The parking standards in Jersey City, they vary by zone, vary by redevelopment plan. It could be one thing on one block and another thing on another block. So one of the strong recommendations was that we have some consistent parking standards. And the way that we did this parking standard was by bedroom, not by total unit count. And so it is more likely that if you are in a studio or one bedroom, that you will not require or need a car, but it becomes more likely that you will need a car if you are in a 2 or a 3 bedroom. So that 0.3 per bedroom will still get you that 1 car per unit. So it's just a different way to look at it. Conversations that we've had with some neighbors and neighborhoods within the Heights requested that we do not permit parking on lots that were less than 50 feet wide. We looked at some of these standards. We took those recommendations seriously, and I kind of want to walk you through where we landed with that. Right, this is kind of what I just walked through again. Bring 3 spaces in a 5-unit building with a minimum 12 bedrooms. 12 bedrooms, 4 spaces are required. So you still have 4 spaces for a 5-unit structure. And the 5-unit structure in a building that is an R1 is most likely going to have at least 1 unit. Of course, that's going to be a studio. So we took the areas that are Ward C and Ward D. These are areas that are in the Heights or immediately adjacent to the Heights. And instead of restricting it for every 50 feet, what we said was that unless you had 26 feet wide for a lot, you could not allow parking. Let me walk you through this. A regular lot in Jersey City is a 25 by 100 lot. In the areas that are now Ward C and D and are on a regular lot, you would not be allowed to create off-street parking. Only if you had more than 25 feet. So you'd have to have 26 feet. That's why I would say 26 feet or more in order to have on-site parking. Some of the reasons that were given to us, and we agree that these are some of the reasons that we agree with some of this analysis, is that the fact that the majority of these houses have, have existed since the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they do not have on-site garages. And part of the increase of demolition or the desire to demolish those houses is to be able to construct a garage and to provide that off-street parking. And so part of looking at the 26-foot wide or the 20-foot wide prohibition is in order to kind of derail that demolition and of course also create and protect on-street parking. This of course will not impact Ward B, Ward F, and Ward A. Recommendation: allow ground floor restaurants as conditional uses in corners. This was the recommendation. We kind of tapered it down. We did not allow a ground floor restaurant. What we did allow is for areas. Now you're actually looking at 2 buildings that are in the R1. They are not in a neighborhood commercial district. These are existing commercial uses that have been there historically over time, especially within the Heights. We have commercial ground floor uses that have just kind of evolved and have been there since the early 1900s. Because these are not permitted uses, it is typically hard to find a tenant. It is typically hard to find or the ability or the access to the resources to be able to fix up these buildings, up these units. And now we are allowing them to be permitted as conditional uses with a caveat that that it's already predominant. So I don't want to go, we have another slide here for that, but you can't just create a commercial, you can't just create a commercial corner use where A, there was not one historically, and B, it is not predominant within the other within the block or or at least the next block. So it can't be a brand new use that you're just creating because you're on a corner. And restaurant is not permitted. It's only allowed to go up to cafe. And so this limits, of course, any kind of seating inside, dining, kind of in dining, and liquor licenses. There's no liquor license that would be allowed. This is primarily for retail uses. And again, it's confined to areas that historically had commercial uses in the buildings, or in areas where it's a consistent development pattern to have corner commercial. And finally, the last conditional use that we are proposing within the R1 district is to allow conditional use surface parking lots. Now, the parking lots would require 20% reserved for electric vehicle charging. These are public parking lots in the sense that we are allowing them to be rented by the hour, by the day, by the month. And they also have to be registered with the Division of Commerce. So we're hoping that this will take some of the lots that are vacant and allowing them some flexibility into creating a surface parking lot with a landscaping requirement, and of course the EV requirement. So since the city does not currently have a sufficient amount of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, this will allow for more places for that electric charging stations to be for the neighbors, for the blocks. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing because I also want to walk you through the city planning webpage if you haven't used it before. So the city planning webpage, it's really just Jersey City / planning, and you can find us here, or you can find us at the Jersey City website. You can kind of go through housing, economic development, and go to city planning. But more importantly, if you haven't used our website yet, it's a great chance to kind of come through. You can see and find our master plan. We updated our stormwater control ordinance a few years ago. And there's some information, FAQs about cannabis, which I know is interesting to a lot of people who don't really know a lot about it, but have been seeing the increase either in applications. The master plan implementation, I'm going to click here so you can kind of see. Again, the phase 1 is already approved. It was approved in October of last year, but you can scroll through here and you can see the corrective zoning, you can see the presentations, you can see the ordinance. The phase 2, again, where we are right now. If you open it, you can see it'll take you to the data portal, and you can see the actual presentations, the handouts that were given, the community presentations, the draft, the text, the map amendments. I'm going to pop over the map amendments so you can kind of see what our map amendments will even look like. Right here again is that RH1, the RH2 at the Sherman Place. There's the R2, that's the Webster Avenue. Some changes that are also being made along Baldwin Avenue is converting the R1 to the RC3. The NC1, the NC2, you see a lot of the RH ones here. But to pop back down, you could even watch the presentation that was given initially just for this. This presentation is a lot more detailed. Again, here's more, the interim document that has the phase 1 approvals on it. And if you want to go down further, you can, or if you don't really want to open that, you just want to pop over to a YouTube video, you can see the phase 2 and the R1 community meeting recommendations. Should you have any additional questions, please reach out to myself or Matt Ward. I am Tanya, TANYAM, like Mary, at jcnj.org. And Matt Ward is MWARD at jcnj.org. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And again, now that you've made it to the end of the video, congratulations. Just want to go over some of the dates with you. That is the August the August date for the first reading, and September for the second reading. Let me just make sure I have those dates right for you. I don't want to mislead anybody on those dates. Again, it's, of course, it's at the beginning of this presentation, so you can always scroll back to that if you need to. August 16th is the introduction at City Council. September 7th will be the second reading, and that's typically where public comment is taken, and the adopting vote is decided. Thank you.